This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Jo Youle. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. And as the streets of Glasgow are now empty after the world's leaders gathered there for COP26 last month, before the clock had struck noon on the day the UN climate talks closed, the Australian government had already said it would be ignoring one of its key outcomes. More than 196 nations came together at the summit, and all of them signed a pact requesting countries revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions at the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next year. Just a few hours later, Scott Morrison said its target to cut emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030, based on levels in 2005, was already fixed and that there will be no further revisions. Cue a collective sigh of disbelief. And that is really just one of the many disappointing outcomes of the meetings held across 2 weeks last month, which have had a pretty mixed bag of reviews. So here to help us unpack what COP26 really means and find some positives to take away and figure out what we can all do to lift our spirits, but also contribute and do our bit for the climate crisis, is a lady who was there for the whole duration of it and who has hopefully now just about recovered from the whole experience. Today, we are joined by author and activist from Global Justice Now, Dorothy Guerrero. Dorothy, welcome to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast.
Hello, good afternoon. Happy to be here. And thanks for inviting me to this podcast.
Well, thank you for making the time to be with us. Dorothy, I know that you were in Glasgow at COP26 for those 2 weeks last month. How are you feeling about it all now that you've had a little bit of time to let it all sink in?
Well, first, I've managed to catch up on sleep because I think for many of us that were in Glasgow following the meetings and at the same time trying to organize events as well in the People's Summit and also respond to interview requests were quite a challenge. So I'm happy to be back on more or less my normal schedule. About the COP, I'm disappointed, I'm frustrated, but at the same time, expecting that it will not be as huge as many people thought so at the beginning. And that is because if for someone who's following this negotiation, this is my 8th COP. I started attending in 2007 when it was held in Bali. That was COP 13. From then, I have seen the failures of many rich countries, the developed countries, in fulfilling the promises from other key negotiations, like in Copenhagen in 2009, the agreement in Warsaw, and also, of course, the COP21 in Paris. So what we have observed is that the COP is a history of failed promises, of goalposts that have been moved, of discussions that were started and then left unfinished, and the hope was that it will be picked up in the next negotiation. So in the last COP before this, the one in Madrid, there had been a lot of unfinished business, especially on loss and damage, on climate finance. And of course, these were all taken up in the Glasgow negotiation. So the result is a bit dismal. There were a lot of hopes that were dashed. So in summary, we hope that it could have been better, but what I can say now is that it's a bad agreement, but it could have been worse. So there's a difference there.
I mean, things are very intense at COP from what I gather. I mean, 2 whole weeks of events and a very intense schedule, as you just described. And obviously, that actually overran by a full day. But that wasn't because there were, the leaders were busy carving out a new deal per se, as you might have hoped, but because there were no real deals made there for the climate in the end. But what would you say did actually come out of COP in terms of a roadmap moving forward?
Well, actually, when negotiations extend by a day, that also means that the developing countries are fighting back. That there are disagreements because there were items in the agenda or in the negotiations that are not acceptable, especially to many developing countries. So actually, it was a positive signal when there is an extension, because that means because if we come to look at the negotiation, it is actually, at the end of the day, countries fighting for their national interest. And what was also became clear for many is that COP26, for the reason that it was one of the COPs that enjoyed almost round the clock coverage by the media, there were more news that came out of it, more analysis, and more live stream coming out of it, that the world leaders were viewed and heard by more people than before. And I think that shows a lot as well how the public perceived it as is important, and then therefore the media followed it, followed that sentiment. So this is the first time, for example, that the Leaders Summit, in this case in Glasgow, the 2 days of World Leaders Summit, attended by around 120 heads of states and government, was live streamed. So things that were mentioned or presented by the heads of states were watched and listened by millions of viewers on their homes, apart from those that are following the negotiation on the UN TV platform, and also those that are present, the very few that managed to get the extra ticket to be there in the plenary. So people's reactions to the event or to the negotiation clearly show an awareness that the climate crisis is already and will increasingly affect everyone globally. So as a global crisis, it demands collaboration. So many were putting their hopes or look at the COP26 as the last best or the best last chance to stop global warming. And that's why despite the pandemic, people took risk. For those coming from other countries, they took the risk, traveled to Glasgow, and also spent a lot of money in those very expensive flights and accommodations in a city with very, very limited rooms for guests that usually come to COPs. Normally, conference of parties by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change attract tens of thousands of people. After Madrid and before the pandemic, the expectation was there will be at least 30,000 people to attend COP26. And I think because of the pandemic, because of the problems on access to vaccines, we're also saying that part of the injustices that are being experienced by the developing countries is also that those that are hit hardest by climate change, despite having the least contribution for the causes, are the very countries that struggle to attend the UN Climate Summit. So despite the fact that it's the best last chance to stop global warming, those that have a high stake on it were not there. And the main reason for this is the ongoing vaccine appetite. So considering this, the interests are high, And I think the global learning was high as well. It was like also a public education in geopolitics, because what viewers and observers, viewers in their homes, observers on the scene, have seen how countries fight for their national interest. And that also showed that climate change is not just an environmental issue. First and foremost, it is also about development. It's also about the economic possibilities for many countries. And that is also the big elephant in the room, that for many developing countries, both developed and developing countries, all our economic activities pollute. They emit emissions. So for those countries that already achieve their prosperity by polluting and at the same time also colonizing other countries and continuing to do so by means of extracting minerals and resources from them because of the current trade, finance, and investment regime. So you would see that the fights on the floor in the negotiation is also about how developing countries can achieve an improvement in their lives, in their economy, while at the same time minding the fact that we are in a climate emergency.
Yeah, I love what you said there about the lessons in geopolitics. There's definitely, that was definitely playing out on an international stage there, which I think is quite rare with that much media attention in this particular scenario. I mean, the COP26 president, of course, Alok Sharma from the host nation of England, said in conclusion that we can say with credibility that we've kept 1.5 degrees within reach, but its pulse is weak, which I kind of found nothing to celebrate in, really. 196 nations agreed to cut their emissions and reduce coal use. But, as we know already, coal is the dirtiest fossil fuel that there is. And the International Energy Agency has said if it's not rapidly phased out, the world doesn't have any hope of staying within the 1.5 degrees of global heating. So I think, one of the hardest fought phrases in the text produced at Glasgow was a commitment to phase down coal-fired power generation. Originally, this was a phase out, but India insisted on that change, despite pleas from other developing countries, which you were just touching on there. The reason why that this maybe dragged on a little bit longer than it was meant to have done originally. I mean, how do you feel about this specifically with regards to coal and fossil fuel?
We have to look back on the history of these negotiations. The basic principle of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is that of common but differentiated responsibilities and capacity. And that has been ignored more than 2 decades of negotiation. The developing countries insisting that they are already hit hardest by the climate change, despite that they have the least contribution to it. But then at the same time, there is also the ignoring that reality that they still need a room for their own sustainable development. And in the Paris Agreement, that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, because under the Kyoto Protocol, under the previous negotiations, there is that strong element that the countries that need to cut down on their emissions must be the huge and historic emitters. So in the Paris Agreement, that was slightly changed or altered, because in the Paris Agreement, the result was that all countries must be responsible and therefore must put their nationally determined contributions, or in effect, these are the short-term plans and targets for countries to cut down their emissions. In the Paris Agreement, when countries put down their NDCs or their nationally determined contribution, the analysis was that if you put all those targets combined, we will end up with minimum 2.7 degrees centigrade average global warming. And 2.7 does not mean 2.7 everywhere, because there are countries, for example, where in that 2.7 could mean more than 3 degrees centigrade. Like, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the research varies, but it could be between 3 to up to 4 or 5 degrees centigrade warming. So there's a big difference between warming, say, in a country like Switzerland and the country, for example, like those in sub-Saharan Africa. So when the negotiation in Copenhagen just emphasized that emerging economies like India and China are not submitting their nationally determined contribution, are not prepared to be at par with other, especially the rich countries, in putting the net zero target by 2050 to reach the average capping of global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, is a huge untruth in that. Because first and foremost, when we talk about the remaining carbon budget, it's not about the meeting the net zero by 2050. It's about which countries have already used up more than their fair share of the atmospheric space. Because let us remember, greenhouse gases remain in air, in the atmosphere, for hundreds of years. In fact, when the UK, where the Industrial Revolution started, the UK had been started its emissions in the 18th century. And until the 1960s, the UK is the number one global greenhouse gas emitter. So you have a leeway there of 200 years of emitting and polluting. While countries like the developing countries under the G77 and China formation, India and China, for example, despite their population, the huge population that are comparatively bigger than that of Europe or US or the UK, their contribution of emission to that atmospheric space is relatively smaller. And also when we count on their national consumption as well, one person in the US, for example, consume equivalent still to 3 persons in China, and maybe 8 to 12 persons in India. And this is average. So despite the difference in the population. So limiting the discussion on that one phrase of phasing down instead of phasing out misses this context. That on one hand, it has weakened that part of the agreement, but at the same time, there's a big history of this inequality, and at the same time, that part of the debate on the atmospheric space used up by the developed countries in the past, in the present, and also the space that they will continue to use in the future is a big element in the negotiation, wherein the countries in the north and the global south do not see eye to eye, because the rich countries do not want to recognize that there's a big difference when they say cut down the emission and when we say fair share.
Dorothy, thank you. Clearly highlighting the fact that there's nothing fair about the share there, which I think is very, very important to this conversation. I know we shouldn't point fingers or name names, but unfortunately, I think that one of the horrors of the aftermath of COP, as I actually already alluded to in the introduction, was the fact that, one man who didn't even want to go to COP in the first place was Scott Morrison. And he was also the one who went on to undermine one of the agreements as soon as COP actually finished, which makes you think that the reason the Australian leader didn't want to attend was because he knew that he had no intention of adjusting their agreements on cutting emissions. And it's usually, one rule for one, and one rule kind of makes it able for everybody else to follow suit. So do you think that, the fact that he's already declared that they're not changing anything has paved the way for maybe even a rebellion for other countries that proclaim they can't make that grade either of needing to keep the world at 1.5, which means that if the rest of the world followed Australia on emissions reductions, the planet will heat by about 3 degrees, which is the end of the road for life as we know it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Australia is one of those notorious countries, together with the US, that has been blocking the discussions on climate finance and also on in terms of the fair share discussions. And I'm not surprised that at first he did not mean to or intend to attend. If we would look also at the track record of Australia in terms of it is high up there in terms of the top emitters. What is interesting is that you really see that the China and India were being pointed as the baddies in the negotiation, but then at the same time closing the eye on the reality that, hey, we ended up another COP without a result on loss and damage, for example, that the facility on loss and damage that the developing countries wanted to see in Copenhagen did not materialize. What they said is that there will be discussions to be started in the next COP in Egypt. So let's look at the fact that this is the 26th conference of parties, and since the COP started, since COP1, we are actually going further and further away from the objective of stabilizing greenhouse gases in the air. And that is because recalcitrant countries like Australia, like the US, Canada, and the other huge emitters kept on delaying, kept on blocking agreements, and kept on finding escape routes and clauses from previous agreements. I mentioned earlier that the first COP I attended was in Bali. In Bali, that was when the Clean Development Mechanism was agreed upon or put in place. At that time, the main debate was the Kyoto Protocol. Will countries like Australia or the US sign the Kyoto Protocol? And I remember the rich countries saying, especially the US, we will sign the Kyoto Protocol if the Clean Development Mechanism will be there. And the Clean Development Mechanism means using offsettings, using carbon trading to address the climate crisis, which again is, these are all false solutions. Instead of appropriate and just solutions, they insist on all these kinds of false solutions. And what happened in 2007? The US ended up not signing the Kyoto Protocol, but we ended up with the Clean Development Mechanisms. And now all these have new names like nature-based solutions, the net zero. So what we have in the history of the Conference of Parties are all these misleading terms and words that, to be purely honest, means delaying, means escaping obligations and responsibilities for the rich countries.
Of course, because it seems that they're pretty good at being a little bit elusive in that department. And I mean, of course, it brings us back to what you were saying earlier, which is, of course, the finance side of things. So, let's talk about money for a moment. No one really likes talking about money, but it needs to be done in this particular context. And I think it's important because obviously in 2009, nations with the most money said that poor countries would receive at least $100 billion a year from 2020 to help them out or to help them cut emissions. But seeing as they are the ones that create the least and have to cope with the biggest impacts of the climate crisis, there is a huge imbalance. And the latest data showed that only $80 billion actually even went to them. And I think, what does this say about the levels of commitment at COP? As you've already mentioned, by agreement made and deals that get struck there. I mean, do they actually mean anything at all? Clearly, Scott Morrison isn't taking note, and he isn't taking things very seriously.
Well, it is important to note that crumbs of money, the $100 billion per year starting in 2020, was promised in COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. And until now, it hasn't happened yet. So despite the fact that in 2009, that amount was already too little and too late, and it's even being delayed because they're now saying it did not happen in 2020 because you're right, the money that were put together by the rich countries only amounted to $78 billion. And then with the new pledges in Copenhagen, there's still around $90 billion. So that even the shadow of that $90 billion was not yet seen by the developing countries. And also, again, a bit of history. That $100 billion per year did not come out from any scientific study. The reality in Copenhagen then was the developing countries were frustrated with the trend, with the negotiation, and they were frustrated that the rich countries don't want to put money where their mouth is when they say, okay, we have to solve climate change. So at that time, the offer was $10 billion per year, starting 2020. At that time, the chief negotiator of G77 in China, Ambassador Lumumba Diaping of Sudan, which at that time was leading the G77 in China delegation, said $10 billion will not even be enough to buy coffins for our people who will be impacted by climate change. And there was a threat from the developing countries to walk away from the negotiation, and that would mean a collapse of the Copenhagen summit. So in a green room type of discussion, meaning secretive and only a few countries were invited, Hillary Clinton at the time, who was there in Copenhagen, sort of like got $100 billion figure from a magical hat. So as I said, it did not come up from a scientific study. At that time, developing countries were already saying that considering the loss being incurred in their economy, in their industries, the loss of property, and at the same time, the real threat of some small island developing countries to lose their territories with the impending rise in sea level, the $10,000 billion will not be enough. And even the $100 billion will not be enough. The current figure that we have in COP26 coalitions is that there should be at least $6 trillion in the pot. And we can look at the reality that if they are having a problem putting together the $100 billion, what more with the $6 trillion? And then also the current pledges on the $100 billion is not grant. This will mostly come out as loans to developing countries, and we know what loans are. It would need to be paid. So the idea that the developing country who are already suffering, and then to address their suffering, they will be pushed to accepting a loan and pay those loans and incapacitate them to address climate or other emergencies because they would be automatically allocating money to pay those loans are pure injustice. So I think a fellow campaigner from Africa, Mohamed Ado, said that it's like someone burned your house, and then that person, the arsonist or the came to you and said, "Oh, I burned your house. Yes, I will give you a loan so that you will build your house." So that's an analogy for it.
The whole thing is just ridiculous in terms of the finance department. There's nothing positive really that comes out of that side of things. And I think the other side of that is the other theme of COP, which of course is looking, as you've already mentioned as well, on the loss and damage side of things, and that is of course the damages caused by the ravages of the climate crisis, and obviously the situations in all those far-flung developed areas that the people that are actually suffering and experiencing the consequences. So things like hurricanes and cyclones, or the inundation of low-lying areas by storm surges. This is the kind of talk that's been going on for more than a decade.
Mm-hmm.
But developing countries didn't really get much in the way of compensation, really, for being the ones who caused the least damage but experienced the most disasters. I mean, many developing countries were hoping that COP26 could provide a further step towards some sort of funding mechanism for loss and damage. Why do you think that this didn't actually happen in the end?
Yeah, well, there is also the fact that in the Conference of Parties, the issue of compensation, or the issue, actually the developed countries don't want to see it as compensation. At first, that was a debate that the word and terms are important in the climate negotiation. Terms like reparations for the loss and damage incurred by the polluting of the rich countries that are affecting the developing countries, the climate finance, these are actually seen and had an international legal basis, because this is an international negotiation, is that the climate finance is an obligation from the developed countries to the developing countries to aid the developing countries to address the impact of climate change and also help them to transition and continue their sustainable development, and in that transition move away from fossil fuels and start going or transiting to a low carbon society. The talk about money is actually at the heart of this negotiation, because as you've mentioned, many countries are already having climate migrants. For example, the people in Kiribati, in Marshall Islands in the Pacific, 10 years ago, they already have people that needed to leave low-lying areas and move to a higher or more elevated areas. And when you lose your territory, when you lose a place where you grew up in, it's not simply like, moving from one place to another, because everything you love, everything, your culture, your community, are from that place, and that doesn't have a price. So even when we talk about climate finance, this is just to make that transition with more ease, or at least it's a compensation for the severe loss and damage that are already being experienced by the developing countries.
Once Upon a Time in Ibiza with Alex Gray.
Soldiers of truth, warriors of love, protesting the ultimate spoof, listening loud, crystal clear, like the rain on a hot tin roof. The magnitude of power embellishing the song, our leaders once more, not right but wrong. The history of failed promises shattering into oblivion, a gasp, dumbfounded at the ungracious dominion. Political, hissing, poetic kissing, placating us with mystery, enraging us through history. You can hear us now, you can see us now. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, a convenient smoky intention yields the fire. The key that unlocks the answers, the solutions, held deeply within us for a climate revolution. No more hesitation, we forever ignite the path to resignation. Dancing with the answers on your stage of light, we stand naked, breath baited, awake through the night. Trusting the elemental whisperings of truth, riding the uprising rhythms of our blues, cloaked in the magic of humanity's wish, we bid you stand down, we blow you a kiss, paving the way for what lies ahead, with faith as the arrow you're shirking to bed. We are now, we are here, we have nothing to fear. No longer will we stand for your agreement to appear. The calling has been sent, for on chorus of song, the brave-hearted stand united, graciously fearless, for the road long.
We were also sort of talking about gender inequality and also the indigenous communities in our last episode. From what you actually witnessed there, would you say that things were equal in terms of the women and men speaking? And what about indigenous communities? Did they get a fair stage? Or do you think indigenous communities were actually paid enough attention to, being as they're in charge of 80% of our remaining biodiversity?
There's actually a lot of lip service by governments on the indigenous communities. It is true, and I agree very much when the indigenous people say that they are the steward of the land. For hundreds of years, their way of life, the way they live with nature, actually is preserving the planet and helping us, the whole planet, in terms of maybe delaying or minimizing the impact of climate change. But when it comes to what will they get out of the negotiation, I addressed, or I did an intervention on the opening plenary of COP26, and it started at 6:15, in the afternoon. It ended at about 9:30. And those of us as NGO constituencies were given the last say. So we had to wait until all the countries finish their initial presentations and remarks or their initial positions. And the indigenous people were the last to be called. The indigenous people constituency in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change were called at 9:27 in the evening. So that shows a lot as well. But then also when it comes to the marginalized, not just the indigenous people, but also people that needed access to the negotiation, the gender balance in terms of the negotiators present and also the official accredited NGO observers in I think on average the UN attendees, the attendees to the UN climate talks average on there would be 14% more men than women, and it is also quite notable if you would look at the names, because that's also something we could look at in the roster of names of delegations and accredited NGOs. It would show as well that more male delegates are there for the whole 2 weeks of the negotiations. So in terms of how many people stayed for the whole 2 weeks, there were more male than females, and also there are more male names in the roster. It may or may not mean there are imbalance, but the 14% higher attendance for men say a lot. But then also the UN is comprised of countries, and the heads of states that we see globally that many countries don't have female head of states or head of delegations as well. But when it comes to those doing the research background study, you will see more female climate scientists and economists that are doing the groundwork. Basically, we can say that.
Interesting. I think, there was a real dissection, I think, of COP25 of exactly how many minutes, women and Indigenous communities got to actually speak. So I look forward to somebody who's actually sat down and charted all of that and actually get the final result. As you say, it's difficult to know the exact numbers from just the guest list alone in terms of who actually got to speak and who didn't. But that's shocking that, as you said, that other event with the Indigenous communities, they got like the last three minutes after everybody else had their say. I think, also the other thing I was reading was that a lot of people said that some countries were going to Glasgow very opposed to stronger action, and tried to suggest that focusing on 1.5 was reopening the Paris Agreement, which is obviously about keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees. And, the one thing I loved, which felt quite positive, was to hear John Kerry from the US repeatedly pointing out that well below 2 doesn't mean 1.9 or 1.8, because clearly that's not well below, and that people going below that got close to 1.5. So there had to be repeated references to the Paris Agreement, but also, as you pointed out earlier, the best available science, which has moved on since that agreement. So it seemed that there was, some positive takeaways, that 1.5 was agreed upon. But, what other hope did you personally get out of COP this year? What was the most positive takeaway for you?
Before the positive, I want to clarify. Despite the new increased or heightened nationally determined contribution, we are still facing 2.4 degrees centigrade average global warming. So 2.4 is far more global warming than 1.5. So if we consider that at this point, when the global average warming is at 1.2 degrees centigrade, we're already experiencing all these calamities and climate-induced catastrophes. What more with a 2.4? So that means double of the length of drought that countries are experiencing now, double the number and frequency of strong typhoons and flooding and and thawing of the permafrost and all that. So it's double of what we are experiencing that now. And it pays to think and imagine, if will the human species manage that? Because the planet will surely exist, but the big question is, can we continue being there in that future? And that there is also, that was backed both by the IPCC report last August, that was repeated by the Antonio Guterres speech at the beginning of the talks as well, that we are still far from 1.5. So the 1.5 degrees centigrade is not yet in the bag. In Paris, it was an aspirational goal, only in the preamble, but not backed by what in the rest of the agreement. The Glasgow Pact is not too different from that. Although it's not aspirational, it was reaffirmed, but reaffirming without actual policy, without actual ways or pathways to receive that, would mean nothing. And then also, despite of everything that was pledged, committed in the 2 weeks of negotiation, we have to think that in real economy, there is that asymmetry of power between state, corporations, and people or communities. Because in the global trade rules, you have what we call the investor-state dispute settlement. These are in the investment treaties or in the investment sections of all the trade treaties. We also call it the corporate courts. So countries run the threat of being slapped by a corporate court case if at the end of the day they decide to do climate action. Transnational corporations, fossil fuel corporations, are already happily suing governments for their climate action. Most recently, for example, Uniper, a German transnational corporation, already sued the government of the Netherlands because the government of the Netherlands, the Dutch government, said that they will stop using coal by 2030. A UK transnational corporation filed, there is an ongoing case against the Italian government, because the Italian government, after decades of campaigns of climate or environmental organizations in Italy, said that they will stop drilling oil in the Adriatic Sea. So in the real world, trade has more teeth than climate agreements. And that is what's worrying me. That's what's worrying my organization, Global Justice Now, because there are now increasing number of such cases that the governments will be facing when they finally do their appropriate actions on climate. So now you ask me, where is the hope, given this grim and really dim reality? I think the hope is in many people that march in the rain, in the cold streets of Glasgow. 100,000 people is probably the biggest protest that this country has ever seen in a long time. And it's not just in Glasgow. There were also 20,000 in London and also other cities. There's 6,000 I've heard from Bristol. There's 4,000 or more in Manchester. So this has become a national for the UK, a national feeling as well. There's a national feeling that people need to have a say when it comes to the climate. And globally as well, there were 50 other protests globally that happened on the Global Day of Action on November 6th. Another hope that I'm seeing is that the youth in the last 2 years, there've been all the Friday for Future protests with tens of thousands of young people marching on the streets, because climate change is indeed a generational justice issue, that those who are young now or born today will have a different future when they turn 15 or when they turn 20. Another hope, I think, is on the acceptance of the responsibilities of the rich countries. More and more people are seeing the justice that the developing countries must be compensated, must be, there were even talks of reparations in Glasgow, which you don't hear much before. It seems that the young activists and then also those who are with the climate justice movement see the importance of reparation and talking about decolonizing the climate discourse, putting the history of colonization and the need for a type of education everywhere that would put the climate crisis in the curriculum. So that's quite hopeful, because that will mean a change in the understanding, a big change in culture, when people see and learn and accept that everybody have a role in solving the climate crisis. But then at the same time, we need to point out who are the culprits. We know that it's the fossil fuel companies who had been denying it since the 1960s and paying lobbyists to deny it, and now presenting themselves as the solutions by all the false solutions, net zero, nature-based solutions, hydrogen as a new solution. All these are the issues that needed unpacking, not just on climate talks, but also on the day-to-day discussions. And I think climate is now on the day-to-day or everyday lives of people and the consciousness.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think, when those images were broadcast of, that 100,000 people that you mentioned, literally like ants, just kind of crawling through the streets from whoever was filming that up above, it was, very, very inspiring, and kind of felt like I really wished that I was there, which I'm sure a lot of people around the world felt the same. But, you guys at the COP Coalition have organised or did organise a global day of action for climate justice with 250 decentralised mass mobilisations across the world planned. How did that actually go in the end?
Our advantage was we had more time than the other organizers that hosted in other countries that hosted the talks. In our case, the delay in the COP due to the global pandemic gave us more than a year, an additional year, to organize. The COP26 coalition is really a very dynamic and rich grouping of networks and movements and campaign groups, organizations, trade unions, youth movement, community, neighborhood associations. It's really a very rich and diverse groupings, women's organizations as well, especially. It's a very rich grouping of people and their organizations and movements. And the decentralized protest was planned because we were also worried that the rate of infection in the UK is climbing up again, and that there could be another lockdown. So we thought that people might be prevented traveling from their places to Glasgow. And we also believe that everyone should do everything they could, the best they could, wherever they are, and do the action that are needed. So we were very, very happy that many organizations in various cities and various capitals and various major cities in the world responded to the call. We did several global movement assemblies online since last year. We held 6 at least. We also have an international committee also to bridge the knowledge from those that are following the negotiations for many years and those that are new to the COP. There were a lot of people who attended this conference of parties for the first time, and there were those who had been following it. So that gap in knowledge and experience, there's a lot of rich discussions on that. It was also a challenge, but at the same time very fulfilling, that the People's Summit, the 4-day People's Summit, were very well attended, many events. We had more than 120 in-person events and more than 100 online, and all of them were well attended and packed. And all the issues were very rich and very diverse. Every issue that you can think of that can be linked to climate and should be linked to climate were discussed with with speakers online and in person.
Massive congratulations on that. I love the fact that you said that you obviously had the extra year because, last year's event was cancelled because of, recent events. I think, since COP, it's quite important to bring up the fact that, some quite, interesting things are already starting to happen. And, we're talking we're only like 2.5, 3 weeks down the line. Beef, palm oil, cocoa, and other products linked to deforestation are going to be banned from entering the European Union under landmark legal proposals that are going to attempt to help prevent the felling of the world's great forests. And, that does feel like a very positive outcome, or at least a move in the right direction. And we do love, to try and include a little bit more positivity towards the end of this podcast. What are your thoughts on this particular news story that's unraveled since COP?
There were those positive outcomes. And I think even if it's limited, the fact that fossil fuel entered the official text is something as well. So we can only say that we can build from that. Many groups and organizations can build from that. But I think for me, I will repeat what I mentioned, that the biggest positive and hopeful thing here is that people realize that if the governments could not deliver, and in this instance, it was obvious that they could not deliver fully, then people have to take it on their hands to educate each other, to organize, to mobilize and demand change, because without that, we could not see big substantial change. And the fact that people with their energy, with their spirit of volunteerism, with their insistence on this discussion is pushing the media as well to cover this is also something positive, because we could not achieve a big change without everyone's participation, and then also the correct the right narrative as well, because there were many instances when coverings of this event or just acceptance of what the governments were saying, that it was a successful summit, that it was a positive outcome, there was an agreement, when in fact, if we analyze that, the agreement, the outcome, there will be a lot of loopholes or a lot of missing or gaps in that agreement. The Copenhagen Pact is far from perfect, but it would be interesting to see how people take it from here, how people will argue for more action, how people will talk more about climate finance, talk more about we need to rewire the global economy, and that if climate is the fight for our lives, then we need to rewrite the rules of the global economic system. The system change, not climate change, is becoming more and more substantial for many, that it's not just an empty slogan, because they are connecting the dots and seeing the many elements that will make that a reality.
I mean, you were just talking about the youth and what this means for people that are being born now in 15 or 20 years' time. And I really loved seeing in the news 2 climate activists shutting down activity at one of the world's largest coal ports last month in Australia by climbing on top of machinery at the port of Newcastle. And they pressed this sort of button and brought down the actual export of coal to a complete and utter standstill. And there was a kind of photo of them like right up above on this massive crane. And, there were actually threats over there of 25-year prison sentences for such action, especially for repeat offenders. But when these 2 young women were actually interviewed in their 20s, they said that they were, the threat was more scary of the future of life with coal in it than what they faced with the future of coal being still produced. And I think exactly what you've just said there, that the youth are our point of hope, really, and their perspective and their action and their optimism moving forward. And I think it's quite interesting, obviously, that COP had a whole day devoted to the youth of the world to actually voice, get their voices heard. Did you meet many sort of young activists there? What was the kind of feeling from that youth day specifically?
Mm-hmm. Actually, when I was traveling to Glasgow from London on the 30th of October, I did not realize that I was on the rail to the COP train. So I just noticed that there's all these young people speaking in different languages. They're speaking Spanish, French, German, and I said, there's a big contingent people going to the COP. And then I realized it was the rail to the COP, and Greta Thunberg is on the same train. But of course, I did not go and found her because I know that she would be very busy. We had also held a movement assembly for the youth in our daily movement assembly. I think a lot of people also supported and came out to the streets on November 5 to accompany the youth, the organized youth that marched that day. So it is there's a positive element in the fact that you have this movement that are rising and growing from strength to strength, and claiming also their position in the whole discourse. So I think the fact that they are articulate, they are fierce, they are committed, could only be positive. And I only hope that they will be continuing their commitment, their activism for many years ahead, because I don't see the climate crisis with this kind of baby steps being done in Conference of Parties to be resolved or to be addressed. It's a sad reality, but at least the climate justice movement has grown exponentially in this decade from the previous ones. And I could see also the narratives, the discourse getting sharper and getting more also about discussing what's wrong with the economy, what's wrong with global rules, what's wrong with corporations always having the upper hand. And the questions how or why there are more people connected with fossil fuels present in the negotiation than many developing countries combined. There were 503 affiliated representatives of fossil fuels present in the meeting than representatives from countries.
Dorothy, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. I think, you've summed it all up there, particularly with, the youth, and just, I think, even spotting Greta on a train almost on the way there. I mean, that kind of, is the future, really. I'd love to get her on the podcast. And we're going to be talking about, as you said, the lack of fossil fuels, those companies being present there, and also the talks this year. I think that's, definitely a step in the right direction. And I really look forward to see what's going to be happening in Egypt next year, where I'm sure we'll actually be attending once again.
And I think in the move forward, we really need a new system of politics too, that reclaims the best of environmentalism, the best of feminism, the best of socialism, the best of indigenous knowledge, the best of youth activism and ideas. All these practices that are already there, we need to continue shaping them for future campaigns, for current and future campaigns. So thank you for having me, and I really appreciate joining you today.
Thanks, Dorothy. Really, really appreciate it too. And we'll see you next year.
Okay.
Talk about the next one.
Hopefully. Okay, bye.
Right.
Take care.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Jo Youle. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Calling upon my witches everywhere, I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere, my brothers everywhere. The time has come to gather.